All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this stormy afternoon. This is our 8th webinar in a series provided by DWR to support the urban water plan, water management plan. And today we're going to cover the water shortage contingency plan. And before we're going to get started, as I do, just to make sure that everyone has the instruction that they need to fully participate. We recognize that some people may have lost power today because of the storm or their network connection. So just want to remind everyone that the webinar is recorded and will be posted onto DWR YouTube channel should you get, if you get dropped off partway through the webinar today. So just as a reminder, we are using the chat panel primarily to provide any technical support should you need to do so. If you want to use that to engage with other participants, you can go ahead. As we present information and have resources, we can also provide links through the chat panel. But really want to encourage you that if you are asking, if you would like to ask questions, we do have specified time throughout the presentation where we're pausing to take questions and asking that you will use the Q&A panel for that. When we have breaks, you can also use the hand raise, so you can ask questions in person. We'd love to hear from you in person if you're comfortable doing so. Just a quick review of the Q&A panel to make sure people are using and taking advantage of the features. You can add a question at the bottom of the panel. You can also, if you see a question that somebody else has presented and you want to upvote it to prioritizing, go ahead and use the vote icon. If you want to respond or expand on a question, you can use the comment to do that and build on it. So this way it allows us to ensure that we cover all the different questions throughout. Okay, and so just to quickly go over our agenda for today, we're going to review the 10 elements that are required for the development of the water shortage contingency plan, including element 2, which is the annual water supply and demand assessment procedures. We're going to start with just a broad overview of the water shortage contingency plan and how it fits into the overall process. And then we have 3 distinct components to our webinar today. We're going to cover 4 elements, take a quick short break, giving both our presenters and all of us a quick break from the screen. Then we're going to focus on element 2, which are the procedures for the annual water supply and demand assessment. And after another short break, we'll cover the remaining elements of the water shortage contingency plan. We'll wrap up with just a reminder of a couple of additional training that we're working on, and we'll adjourn at 4 o'clock. We're going to try and maximize the time that we have for Q&A. If we do not get to some of the questions, which I don't think has been an issue in past workshops, but if that happens, we will track all your questions and provide responses after the workshop. So wanting to make sure that we address all the questions that you've come to ask. We'd ask you during the registration to just share with us about your familiarity with preparing the plan. We had 248 registrants at the time, which is actually exactly how many participants we have today on the webinar. And you can see that there are quite a good number of you who this is your first time doing the plan. Most of you have some support in doing so. Several of you have already done this plan multiple times, and part of the reason for having these training workshop is really to focus on updates and changes and new requirements as you're working through it. So we will be focusing on that today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Fateh Ben Jamaat, Chief of the Water Shortage Contingency Plan section at DWR Water Use Efficiency Branch, followed by Julia Ekstrom, Senior Environmental Scientist Supervisor with DWR Water Use Efficiency Branch.
Thank you, Orit, and welcome everybody. Water shortage contingency plans. So, as the name says it, a water shortage contingency plan is used to plan for water shortage, and that includes, of course, drought, but also other times of supply shortage that can be caused by natural disasters, fire, flood, earthquake, and so on, and also system failures. As such, the water shortage contingency plan is supposed to be a tool to enhance the water supplier's preparedness and its ability to respond to shortages in a timely manner. So what is new in terms of requirements this round?
I'm in.
Do you hear me? Oh, okay. So after some really hard lessons from the 2012 and 2016 drought, and the sheer example of East Porterville community that ran out of water, everybody heard about, the 2018 legislation has emphasized the need and further actually emphasized the need for drought and water shortage planning, and hence required, this is in lieu of existing water shortage contingency analysis in previous requirements as part of the urban plans. The legislation required urban suppliers to formally adopt a water shortage contingency plan with 10 specified elements, 6 standard shortage levels, and also procedures for annual supply and demand assessments. Gwen and Nancy will go over in more details in today's training about those. Now, what do we mean by standard? Standard actually doesn't mean rigid or non-flexible. To the contrary, under each of the specified elements of your plan, the supplier would include their own procedures, their own actions according to their specific conditions, and basically what makes sense for them. So the shortage plan is a tool for the supplier. Even with, let's say, the 6 standards for shortage levels, 10%, 20%, 30%, and so on, the legislation allows for different levels or different triggers as long as you provide a crosswalk table that links your levels to the standard levels. The idea, of course, of standardizing the shortage contingency plan is for everyone to be on the same page. We all talk the same language. It would certainly improve communication, coordination, and regional and state level coordination, as I said, and would facilitate and prioritize drought and water shortage assistance and help at the state level. Example, if, let's say, we would like to provide assistance and help for communities struggling with shortage, it wouldn't be helpful to have a list of suppliers reading this supplier is at stage 3, this supplier is at stage C or B, this supplier is at stage critical or moderate, ideally, it would be more clear and more useful to translate all those stages to the standard percentages of shortage as dictated by the legislation. Another aspect of flexibility is that the plan does not prevent the supplier from undertaking actions not specified in the plan, and also the ability to update the plan anytime outside the 5-year cycles. So the last point I want to make before passing the mic to Julie is one important component of the plan of the new requirements is the supplier's procedures to conduct annual water supply and demand assessments. This is an important component allowing the supplier on an annual basis to proactively conduct a water shortage assessment. This is to enable them to predict potential shortages for the year ahead and accordingly prepare and undertake appropriate actions ahead of time. And therefore, putting the shortage contingency plan to work even before a shortage occurs. So this is in a nutshell why it's important to have a plan and what the new requirements look like. And I hope you will get the most out of today's training, and I'll pass the mic to Julie. And thank you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Fatih, for laying out the importance of the water shortage contingency plan and some of the intro to the terminology that's relatively new. So we also wanted to recognize in terms of logistics, that the water shortage contingency plan is a standalone plan that is submitted as part of your urban water management plan, but it is a plan in of itself. So what this means is that it's submitted the same, it's due in the same date as the urban water management plan and with it as a single package, but it can be pulled out. And we're going to go through this in an upcoming training module about the process of submission, submitting these plans and how that those procedures that are required. But the way to think about it is that it is both part of the urban water management plan, but also standalone. And so if you go into one more slide, Arit. Great. So the water shortage contingency plan contains all the elements that we're reviewing today. And so that should be very helpful. And that there are portions of what is in the main part of the urban water management plan that feed into informing the water shortage contingency plan. And Gwen's going to go over this part, but as you may or may not be familiar with in the urban water management plan in the guidebook, it's covered. The reliability assessments and the drought risk assessment are covered in Chapter 7. And this is a combination of your supply characterization and your demand characterizations event. And so you do that analysis as part of your urban water management plan, and then you do the assessment of this, or analysis of these assessments as to include as part of your water shortage contingency plan. So we realize that this is a lot of terminology, and what belongs where. So we've tried to clarify that in the guidebook and also in this training today, so that can help with some of the terminology. And so this gets into the next slide. So today we're focusing on the water shortage contingency plan. So just in terms of logistics, like I said, the water shortage contingency plan is treated as a separate element. That this is largely, as it's written in the water code, this is because it can be updated in between urban water management plan cycles, which as you may know, the urban water management plan is due every 5 years. And so if there are changes that you want to make in the interim to your water shortage contingency plan, the water supplier can do that. So they don't have to wait for the 5-year increments, because there may be lessons learned or new information available or new ordinances you might want to include in your water shortage contingency plan. This also means, because it's a separate element, the water code requires that it is a simultaneous adoption you can go through, but you do have to adopt them separately. And we're going to go through this more in the February 10th training. So in the upcoming training we'll have, we're going to go through the procedures for adoption and then and preparation of the urban water management plan and the water shortage contingency plan. The next slide that kind of feeds into the bigger picture of these trainings, that this is our 8th training, as Arit said, that for the assistance to help prepare those that are developing the urban water management plans. And so what we have done this year, as we've mentioned in all the other trainings, is that we're doing it based on specific topics. And so we are recording these, so they essentially create modules for specific topics that you can then go back and you can attend, of course, live, or if you, as you are preparing that portion of your urban water management plan, you can go back to the YouTube video. All of these are recorded and posted on DWR's YouTube site in its own playlist. So as you work on these different sections, you can refer to the module, the training sessions. And then, so what we're showing here are what's covered in our modules. We have first on the left side of the screen is the SBX 77 compliance. And so we actually, so those are actually provided training sessions in 3 different modules. And the core of the urban water management plan, the supply, demand, reliability, how they feed into the drought risk assessment. And then this also feeds into the water shortage contingency plan. That's what I see as the core, and then how climate change can be incorporated into that. And we also have the energy reporting and delta reliance. So in the next slide, we just put on the what these training module numbers are. For the next slide, thanks. Oh, sorry, yeah, there we go. Okay, one more time, I think. Didn't mean to have animation there. Okay, so we have them numbered, so they rolled out in any specific order. Of course, you don't have to watch them in any specific order, but I'd probably recommend starting with number 2, the drought risk assessment. But these are the topics that we've covered so far. And like I said, on the preparing and submittal procedures is going to be covered in the February 10th workshop. And so we'll have that one available soon. And we're going to have one more later this spring. We don't have a date scheduled yet, because once the WUI data portal, which is the electronic submission website where you're going to submit these plans and the individual tables, once that is prepared, we'll hold a workshop that walks you through how this website works, how, all the different technical details of submitting your plan through that system. And so anyway, so thank you all for attending. We're going to get on with the main content.
Great, thank you, Julie. Before we turn to Gwen, there are a couple of questions about the adoption, and I know you're going to cover more of that at the next training, but I'm wondering if you can just briefly touch on these. Specifically,
Sure.
there is a question from Lindsay. Can the urban water management plan and the water shortage contingency plan be adopted as part of the same resolution?
I think they can be adopted as part of the same resolution as long as they are called out separately in that resolution. So they can be the same part of the same public hearing process and votes as long as they are called out as separate plans.
Okay, and then another question from Paul with regard to that is, can you clarify today what is meant by dual simultaneous adoption, meaning same public hearing or two separate public hearings? There are a couple of questions on that. Do you have answers for that you can share?
Sure. So the dual simultaneous adoption means that you can have them you could put them in the same public hearings, but you want to put them as different agenda items, and so you can use the same public notification process, or the same public notice, but you want to make sure to clarify that it's covering both of these plans, so that they're treated as separate. Which makes me think that Fenty, do you have any like confirmation or clarification if it is a single resolution, or if they call out both plans separately, or if it needs to be two separate resolutions?
I think what you said makes sense. A single resolution calling out, this is for the urban water management plan and the water shortage contingency plan. That should do it. There is no need for separate resolutions.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Julie. And then there is another question that is on everyone's mind, of course, is when will the final guidebook be available?
Okay, so it's with the copy editors now, so that's the good news. I can't say the exact date. If all goes well, it will be in February, when we are working as hard as we can to get that out. And we know everybody is waiting, so thank you for your patience, or apologies for the delays. We just want to make sure that we get, it's actually, been this trade-off that having this series of webinars has actually triggered a lot more questions, and so that we've been able to incorporate the feedback into the guidebook as we get it. But I wouldn't suggest continuing to send a lot more feedback, because we're pretty much at our cutoff point to incorporate things. But so soon, we're hoping in the next few weeks.
All right, thanks, Julie. And the last just logistical item, there is a question about if there are additional questions beyond this webinar, can we include in the chat the email for people to ask additional questions?
Yeah, we're gonna have questions be sent to the UWMP help. So I'm gonna type that under this question, and we can also put that in the chat, because it's
okay, great.
All
right, so I want to make sure that we go ahead, start with Gwen's presentation. So hopefully this had covered the initial questions, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Gwen.
Unmute. Hi, I'm here. Okay, give me just a moment. Okay, is that working okay? Can you see the full screen?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Gwen Huff, and I'm with Department of Water Resources. You might recognize my name from the 2015 round of UWMPs. I've come back as a retired annuitant to help with the 2020s. So look forward to helping you guys through this round. I'm going to talk about the elements that have to go into your water shortage contingency plan as required by the Water Code. So the water code says that every urban water supplier shall prepare and adopt a water shortage contingency plan as part of its urban water management plan that consists of each of the following elements, and there are 10 of them. And the course of this presentation will be going over all 10 of them. Retailers are required to address all 10. Just look at those quickly. No need to memorize it. We'll be talking about each one. Wholesalers, there are 3 elements that they do not have to address in their water shortage contingency plan. Items 6, 8, and 9. Beyond those 10 elements, there's also a seismic risk assessment and mitigation plan. Okay, this is aside from the 10 elements that we just listed. You're now required to specifically address seismic risk to your water system facilities and to have a mitigation plan. And this is new for 2020. If you feel like you don't quite have this together, there are some resources for you. You can rely upon a couple of these. They may not have it entirely, but they could be very helpful. The local hazard mitigation plan. This is generally by county, and it was required from the Federal Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. It doesn't necessarily include impacts for specific water systems, okay? But it might give you an idea of the kind of hazards in your county. There's also the Emergency Response Plan, and that came out of the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. And this is required for water systems and submitted to the State Resources Control Board. So this is a plan that's very specific to water systems. And if you have a seismic risk, it would be included in that ERP. You can refer to the ERP, you can take references out of it, you can include the entire ERP as an attachment or addendum to your water shortage contingency plan. And there's another planning tool that could be helpful for you in seismic risk assessment. And the California Office of Emergency Services has an online planning tool, and you can see the link is right there. And it has maps that include shaking hazards, landslide zones, etc. And you will upload a shapefile of your area, and that will help you explore what risks are expected, right, for your area. So these are some resources to help you in your seismic risk assessment and mitigation plan. And I'll just point out that it is 2 parts. One is the risk assessment, and 2 is the mitigation plan. So both of those will be required beyond the 10 elements that we're just about to go into. And I just wanted to say that I'm going to be covering a couple of submittal tables that go into the UWMP from DWR. There's more to it than the tables. The code doesn't specify the format of a water shortage contingency plan, right? There's no end to what you can include. Narrative, charts, graphs, all of that is good. Whatever you think best communicates your plan with as much detail as you care to provide and that you think is useful. At a minimum, all elements required in the water code, which we're covering today, and the submittal tables that DWR has created, tables 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and we'll be showing those later on today. And these tables capture the requirements for element 3, shortage levels, and tables 8.2 and 8.3, element 4, response actions. So do include those tables in your water shortage contingency plan. Element number 1, unless I should stop for a second in case, or read, there might be any questions so far.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions if you want to follow up on. Are you stating that the updated ERPs as required by AWIA are to be submitted to the state water board, or are you referencing past plans? There's some clarification questions here.
Julie?
So I see in a lower question that it makes the statement that the emergency response plans contain confidential information are not intended to be public documents. So we are not asking you to submit anything that's not for a public document. This is referred to as a one place to that you might want to reference or get material to prepare your water shortage contingency plan. And so if there were, I think that question is regarding, was that brought up regarding the seismic risk? Is that where you pointed to it, Gwen?
Yeah, it is
Okay.
where I pointed
So, okay, so I mean, the suggestion that we raised that in the first place because part of the work group for developing the guidebook was reminded us or point to this as a useful resource. And it would be in the supplier's best interest to make sure that your water shortage contingency plan and your emergency response plan are lined up or are consistent with each other. And so, but we're not asking you to release any sensitive content or, you know, make something public that is not supposed to be public. So if that helps, does that help clarify?
So the clarification is that these are reference information that you suggest align with the water shortage contingency plan. As Gwen mentioned, there's a question, Gwen, about you had the slide with all the elements, and the question is, does each element need to be its own individual chapter when it's
well, back to the thing that the water code doesn't specify a format. If you want to do it, each one is a chapter, that's fine. It's up to you how you want to format your water shortage contingency plan, as long as you do address all these items.
Okay. And let's see, what is the deadline for submitting the water shortage contingency plan? If the plan is in the process of being updated to align with the water code, should a draft be submitted with the urban water management plan?
Julie, I think I'll try it, but you can help me out here. You have to submit the water shortage contingency plan with the urban water management plan. And the code doesn't say that a draft can be submitted. So you should have your final water shortage contingency plan, most up-to-date version, submitted with your urban water management plan. Is that correct, Julie?
That's correct, yeah.
Right. Okay, so I think we're good right now. There is a question about specific questions about the tables, which you're going to be covering, so I'm going to hold off.
Okay.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and I just want to remind us, our lesson from the previous workshop was that, you know, I just started answering some of these questions, typing them, but I realized that because this is recorded, it's in the best interest for the people viewing it later that we read out the questions, right? Or is that what?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I'm
I'll
going to
stop
be doing that.
typing the answers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And there is one raised hand, so I'll let's see. No, that was just, yeah. Okay, let me see. No, I think we're good, Gwen. Why don't you get started? I think it would be helpful for everyone to hear your presentation, and as you go through some of the tables, it might answer some of the questions that they have.
Okay. So item number 1 in this list of 10 plus seismic, right? Okay. So in the list of 10, number 1, analysis of your water supply reliability. So water supply reliability is the balance of supply and demand, and that's how you get your reliability. And there are 3 assessments associated with the urban water management plan. One is your long-term assessment. It goes over 20 years. One is the near-term assessment, 5 years, and then the annual assessment. This near-term 5-year drought risk assessment was covered in another workshop by DWR, and I think Julie went over where all
And
those workshops are.
Tulian Young. That was, yeah, Tulian Young presented a lot of that work.
Okay, yeah, right. That's workshop number 2 if you go to our trainings. The annual, we're going to be discussing this. It is an element, one of the 10 that you include in the water shortage contingency plan is the procedures that you plan to follow when you do your annual risk assessment. You don't have to include it, the plan, the annual risk assessment, but you do have to include the procedures, and we're covering that. Nancy King is covering that later in this presentation. But for purposes of item number 1, this analysis of reliability, you will provide an analysis of this long-term and the near-term drought risk assessments that you have already done here, if you recognize these tables. So we call our chapter 7 in the guidebook, and it's reliability assessments. There's 2 of them. The long-term goes out for 20 years, and you give a supply and demand comparison for a normal year, and you go out 20 years. A single dry year, go out 20 years. Multiple dry years, going out 20 years. This is our long-term comparison. Doesn't provide a lot of detail, which is appropriate because it is such a long-term plan. The nearer term is 5 years, and that's 5 years beginning in 2021. If you were, this is the drought risk assessment, which was covered in the other workshop. If the next 5 years were to be a drought, then you're going to give an assessment and a summary thereof in this table. So what you have to put in your water shortage contingency plan is an analysis of these 2 assessments. The word analysis is not defined in the water code. It can include a summary of the assessments, narrative, graphic, tabular. You can include those tables that I just showed you. And you want to include a discussion of the key issues that may create a shortage. That is item number 1, the analysis of your reliability assessments. Are there any questions on that?
There is a question from Spencer. Would the second year in the 2025 column be considered 2026 or 2027?
You're talking about table 7-4, this column here. So I'll point out that what this does, and it takes a minute to understand this. 2025 is the first year here. The first year of a 5-year drought period, beginning in 2025. The second year would be 2026, that's reported here. The third year, 2027, etc., down for 5 years. So if you had a 5-year drought beginning in 2025, you would report it down here. And same thing, if the drought 5 years started in 2030, you would report here. This drought risk assessment begins in 2021. This is a closer look at the next 5 years. That's the drought risk assessment. After that, then it's this table here. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Gwen. We have Leah Brown who would like to ask a question. So I'm just allowing you. You should be able to unmute now and ask your question. Okay, I don't see, I don't hear anyone, so maybe that was just an accident. Let's see. Nobody else. Okay.
Okay.
One question as you go through your presentation, a question from Thomas, just a more general ask, if possible, as you proceed through your steps, could you please indicate whether they are new or existing requirements?
Oh. Well, Julie, can you help on that?
Yeah, I can help on that. And you know, in terms of what Gwen just went over, the expansion to the 5-year drought versus 3 dry years, consecutive dry years, is the big difference. So in terms of existing, I mean, the law of these requirements was passed in 2018. So I think you mean prior, like for the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan versus what is now current law. Yeah, we'll try to
Yeah, help me flag that in
pin
case
those.
I
Okay.
don't. I can say that the seismic risk assessment is new. That was not there in 2015 as a requirement. And when you do that analysis of your water reliability, right, those are not the tables that we're going to require in the water shortage contingency plan. These tables, you can, but you're going to analyze the information from these tables and all that you did, right, and summarize and put that into your water shortage contingency. And that this is a new analysis from 2015 in that, one, you didn't have to do a 5-year drought risk assessment before. That's new. And the period of time for a drought is now 5 years. This table 7.4 used to only go through year number 3. So that's different. But these particular tables aren't specifically called out for the water shortage contingency plan. An analysis of them is.
Okay,
And
thanks, Gwen.
you know, another thing to flag, Gwen, is that the whole plan itself was not a requirement as a plan in the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. The water shortage contingency plan wasn't a standalone document prepared. There was a requirement to have a water shortage contingency analysis, and so that water code was changed quite a bit, which we're happy to send the person that is questioning about, you know, what the differences were in the code. We've included that in one of the appendices of even in the draft guidebook, so it can show how that was marked up. There's quite a lot of changes in the water code.
Okay, I think we're ready to move forward, Gwen.
Okay, so item number 2 is the procedures for the annual supply and demand assessment. We're going a little bit out of order here. Nancy is going to talk about that at length after our first break. Before we go to that, I'm going to skip to item number 3, 6 standard water shortage stages. So the water code, and this is a new requirement, requires that you use 6 standard water shortage levels, and they correspond to ranges of up to 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50% shortages and greater than 50. That is new. And as a sort of a side note, these shortage levels shall also apply to catastrophic interruptions of water supplies. So if you have a catastrophic interruption, you could go ahead and activate any one of the shortage levels that apply, at your stages that apply, and the corresponding actions. Now, a lot of people, a lot of water agencies already had existing levels that were not the same as the newly required 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% in this new legislation. And the code addresses that you may still use those same levels that you've had historically, and you, for whatever reason, don't want to change them, as long we will accept that as long as you can correlate your levels to the 6 standard. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So basically, these are the stages, right? And these are increasing levels of shortage. Stage 1, a 10% shortage. And these are a percentage of unconstrained demand. So if you're constraining demand, it's probably because you have shortage, right? So basically, those are the shortage, the stages and what they relate to, and how you're going to have to report that if you don't have those same stages, how yours correspond to these stages. And this is one of the tables that we require in your water shortage contingency plan. Table 8.1, and those percentage shortage ranges are hardwired in there. You can't change them. Your shortage response actions, a brief narrative summary of what the actions would be. There's more detail in other tables, but for this table, a brief narrative summary. And about this standardization of stages, it allows clear communication between individual suppliers, a supplier and their customers, and between the suppliers and the state. So when anyone says we are in level 3, everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. Previously, if someone mentioned a level 3, they would have to describe what their level 3 looked like, because it could be vastly different from anyone else's level 3. So there we are. And again, the catastrophic water shortages will utilize these same stages and response actions that are outlined in the plan. If you have different stages and you want to keep them, the Water Code authorizes you to continue using those own shortage levels. However, you must include a narrative or a graphic describing your shortage levels in relationship to the 6 standard levels prescribed by the state. We use the term crosswalk, right, in our guidance. So you must provide a crosswalk that clearly translate your current shortage levels to those mandated by the state. This can be a narrative, graphic, or both. And this is an example of a graphic depiction of the crosswalk. So on the left, these are my 5 stages. I'm a water supplier, and I'm gonna stick with them. So I have to say, how do those relate to the water shortage contingency plan required levels? Are there any questions?
Can I do a real quick flag here, Gwen, of the things that are new in this?
Yeah, please.
Of what Gwen just went over. Okay, so the current requirements now require what Gwen just went over as the reliability assessment. This is an update or a change from what was required previously for the 2015 urban water management plans. In that, the requirement was an estimate of the minimum water supply available during each of the next 3 water years based on the driest 3-year historical sequence for the agency's water supply. So that was 2015. Now it's out to, what Gwen just described as the 5 dry consecutive years. Then also wanted to flag that. So
that was going back to item number 1, the analysis of the water supply reliability. Okay, I'm with you.
Yes, thank you. Okay. then the other thing to flag is did you already go over this, the 6 specific water level shortage levels? Did you just go through? Yes, okay. So she just went through the 6 shortage levels. Now this is a change from what was required in the 2015 urban water management plans, where in that previously it was stages of action to be undertaken by the urban water supplier in response to water supply shortages. What this had said is including up to 50% reduction in water supply and an outline of specific water supply conditions that are applicable to each stage. So you'll see that in table, I'm just gonna guess, 8.1, yes. So the draft version that we've shared with you had, I think that it had mislabeled that column title. It said, instead of shortage response actions to be summarized right there in the draft, which we've updated. So Gwen's showing what you're gonna see when we get the final version out. It was called the water description of water supply conditions or something like that. So that's been just a flag that too. But so that's the difference. So the between 2015 and the current requirements. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple of clarification with regard to the crosswalk. Greg is just asking for clarification that if he says, let's say you have 3 or 4 stages, presumably you can relate them like your stage 1 is equivalent to stage 1 and 2 of the standard 6 levels. Do you want to talk a little bit about how do you go about transitioning or doing the crosswalk when you have 3 or 4 levels and then you're going to 6 levels?
You know, is Sabrina on? Because I think she went into a lot of work about how to do crosswalks.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes.
honestly, it's really up to you guys what makes best sense for, you know, translating this into the different stage levels. You know, this little example here, it's going to be rough because when you have less, you know, categories and you're trying to make it into more categories, you know, there's going to be one category that's of yours that's going to fit into maybe 2 categories of the other, or you might split things. So, you know, it's going to be very much up to the water supplier themselves to identify what is the best fit of the crosswalk. You know, the one that's example here, it starts off pretty easy. But then, you know, we get down to that water emergency thing where, you know, in that particular example, it was really just for the over 50. So, you know, maybe the arrow doesn't go from number 5 to number 5 and number 6. Maybe it just goes straight to number 6, and then number 4 goes to number 4 and number 5, right? So you're just going to have to do the best you can. You don't have to keep your old versions. You can translate to the new one if that's easier, or you can try and do a crosswalk to whatever best makes sense to fit the new requirements for the 6 levels.
Thank you.
Sabrina, just to follow up on that, a question about where this crosswalk resides. Somebody's asking if an urban supplier has existing water supply shortage levels described in their 2015 UWMP, but not in a standalone water shortage contingency plan, may a crosswalk be utilized in the 2020 urban water shortage management, water management plan. Sorry.
Well, ideally what you do is you put something like this, or a descriptive of something like this, or, you know, whatever, or, you know, a different diagram of something like this in your water shortage contingency plan. So it's very clear that, you know, your old water shortage contingency plan or analysis, that's what you had at the different stages, and this is how they compare to the required stages. And then, you know, you go forth and you continue doing the rest of your 2020 water shortage contingency plan in accordance with the stages that you like to work with, which came out of 2015. Now, this is just an example here. This I don't even remember which water supplier I pulled that example out of, but I pulled an example of someone that had done their stages and what they considered each one. And I said, well, what could they do if they were trying to do a crosswalk to the 2020. And so I just did this, and I've got, PowerPoint arrow off, but this is just an example anyway. And I really don't think, there's only one supplier for which this works because it's just an example from one supplier. So you're going to have a completely different thing on the left side. Each supplier should likely.
Okay, and the intent is to take whatever your system looks like on the left side and just find ways to demonstrate how it matches those 6 levels. There is a question if you could elaborate on the narrative description of the water shortage conditions. Again, your example has, it says moderate, severe, critical, and such. Is that sufficient? What information needs to be included from the narrative perspective?
I just mentioned that was updated. So, right, that's from table 8.1, Gwen, that they're referring to. So this is the final version of table 8.1 that's been updated. So it asks for a narrative description of your shortage response actions, not of the water shortage condition.
Okay, so just clarifying. I think the question is about the crosswalk, where on the left it actually has a narrative describing the condition, but what you're saying that is not necessarily what's needed. That's just an example of one supplier's definition of the different stages.
Correct. I mean, and if you want to put something, if your old plan had things like that, you can, certainly, if it was obviously put in there because it made sense to this particular supplier to look at things that way. To think about 20% reduction, they consider that moderately restricted. So if that works for you, if this kind of, descriptive element on the left that you put in your 2015 water shortage contingency plan works for you, then by all means keep it there. This is just because you're allowed to keep, your stages that you used in 2015, so long as you do the crosswalk so you can see what the equivalent 2020 levels are. But you can continue to use, your 2015 stages.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
However you want to describe them.
So a more general question from Wendy, since the water shortage contingency plan is meant to be a standalone document, is there a minimum requirement for what must be included within Chapter 8 of the UWMP itself? Can we simply just say, see complete water shortage contingency plan attached?
That should address it, right? If the water shortage contingency plan addresses all the elements in the code, the Chapter 8 is all the requirements for the water shortage contingency plan. And that should suffice. That addresses all the requirements in the code. That could be your Chapter 8, as long as you can take it out as a separate document. Is that right, Julie?
Yep,
yeah.
That's my understanding.
It doesn't have to be embedded in a chapter. In fact, I think it's probably more useful to a supplier if it's put in as an attachment, so that they can take that attachment out and they can also have it there to look at during the drought or when they're making decisions, and they don't have to flip through to find Chapter 8 in this big urban water management plan, and then they can more easily update it and things like that.
Okay, I think it's a good idea now to move forward. I know you're going to talk about the shortage response actions next, and there was a question about that. So why don't you go through your presentation and we'll come back to questions.
Okay. Item number 4 in the list of 10, shortage response actions. So these shortage response actions align with your defined shortage levels that we just talked about. And at a minimum, they're going to have supply augmentation actions, demand reduction actions, operational changes. I'm going to skip to E. For each action, an estimate of the extent to which the gap between supply and demand will be reduced by implementation of the action. I think there's going to be some discussion about that. And we'll talk about it in a minute. And D is just a statement that you have to go above and beyond state mandated requirements. So we're going to talk about all these. The DWR tables, table 8-2 covers demand reduction actions, additional mandatory prohibitions above state mandated, and an estimate of the extent to which it closes the shortage gap. That's table 8.2. Table 8.3 covers augmentation actions, operational changes, and other actions. And again, an estimate of the extent to which that action will close the water shortage gap. And this is table 8.2. In table 8.2, we have to align it with the shortage level. This is 1 through 6 that we talked about before. There's a drop down of the demand reduction actions. And these demand reduction actions were taken from the last 2 rounds of UWMPs and compiled to try and come up with the most standard responses, but there's of course always other at the bottom. So you take from the drop-down menu, select one or select other. How much is this action going to reduce the shortage gap? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then lastly, is there a penalty, charge, or other enforcement? Julie, did we modify that drop-down for penalty enforcement, yes or no, to say not applicable?
Wait, not applicable to wholesalers to respond to
Okay.
that. So we didn't add a not applicable on the options. We just put a note in this cell that's the column
Okay.
header that said not applicable to wholesale. Do you want me also flag the old versus the new requirements?
Yes.
Throw on this? Okay. So in the previous version of the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan, the water shortage contingency analysis, it's called, required some specific mandatory prohibitions against specific water use practices during water shortages. This is including but not limited to prohibiting the use of potable water for street cleaning. And then they had consumption reduction methods that were required in the most restrictive stages. And so that language from the water code has been removed for the person that was asking that we just flag the changes.
Thank you. So table 8.2 is the demand reductions, but other actions that can be triggered are supply augmentation actions and other actions. Because there were fewer supply augmentation actions, we put the others in this table as well. And once again, you align it with your shortage levels. Take from the drop down what actions there are. Expand public information campaign, transfers, and then other, of course, at the bottom. Once again, how much is it going to reduce the shortage gap? So you notice that the code and the tables both require that you estimate the impact of each response, the action that you employ. And that would be a quantitative estimate, ensuring that the entire shortage gap is accounted for. So if you were put together all your actions for shortage level 1, whether demand reduction or supply augmentation or other, together you should cover, all those together should cover the 10% shortage gap that you will have in stage 1. Some actions are difficult, if not impossible, or at least difficult. Some people, some agencies we heard are able to quantify the results of their actions, but public information campaigns, for example, aren't necessarily quantifiable. And you can simply put in the narrative in that line that it's a boost to other actions or something to this effect, and doesn't necessarily have a standalone effect. And I'd like Julie to just talk a little bit more about these quantifications and the challenge of coming up with the number, but the importance of doing so.
Sure, I'll give my best. So we've gotten quite a few questions on this topic, and we realize that there's that suppliers would, or those of you that are preparing the plans, want resources for how to quantify. And I think that Gwen has a slide coming up that points to some resources available. There you go. And DWR doesn't, oh yeah, that's great. But it's not, first of all, it's not going to be an exact science, and it's not necessarily going to be transferable for how effective certain actions are for one supplier versus another. That depends on your climate, the how water is used, what the behaviors are of the users, what the notion, like what the supply looks like. So there's all sorts of particulars that would make a huge difference in translating how effective this one type of action is, what that means in terms of water savings or water augmentation. So that's part of why we don't have the, just a handbook on how to do this. But then getting back to the point of why this is important, because we've also had questions about, do we actually have to submit a quantified estimate? And the law states that it has to be the extent of reducing the shortage gap. And so that does imply a quantified, amount, whether it's in volume, and we want to ask you, to include what units you do include, or percentage, but in the end, you want to have, each of your demand for, say, shortage level 3, your demand reduction actions and your supply augmentation and other actions should add up to filling that shortage gap, right? So there's no way to validate that for yourself, for the supplier, if they don't have some estimates of the extent that each of the activities is going to close it. And again, what Gwen said, just reiterating that some of these actions are going to be more of support for the other actions, and that's fine, that's great. We encourage you to still list them so that they are there and ready, and that even if you don't have a specific estimate of their benefit.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, the important point, I think when I'm looking at that is that you want to address that percent shortage that you have at whatever level you're at. Make sure that your actions are going to fill that gap.
And I guess we should also flag that this is for wholesalers and retailers. There will be a lot of actions that don't, in those drop downs that don't apply to wholesalers. That's fine. Just pick the ones that do apply to you. And there is, in the draft version of these tables on the Excel template, the tab was mislabeled as 8-3, table 8-3R, but it wasn't in the name. So the 8-2 and 8-3 are for all suppliers to submit.
Okay, thank you. So just to let you know, there were several questions that spoke to the quantifications of these actions that Julie just responded to. Just to be mindful of the time and to make sure that we have enough time to cover all the topics that we have, I'm going to just check with you, Gwen. Did you cover all you were going to cover up to this point?
You mean how much do I have left?
Yeah, did you finish your presentation? Can we take a short break or?
I think I've got just a couple more minutes
Okay.
and
go
then I'll
ahead.
be done. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So in that list that we showed earlier of the code, sorry. Here. D, additional mandatory prohibitions. I'm sorry. Okay, so you have to list in here additional in your water shortage contingency plan and the actions that you're going to implement, additional mandatory prohibitions against specific water use practices that are in addition to the state mandated prohibitions. For example, and this is retail only. For example, in 2014, the Water Board came out with a regulation which included that Californians will be expected to stop washing down driveways and sidewalks. The question that I have, which I may not be answerable, is how will you know when you're preparing your stages and your responses what the state is about to impose? Well, you can't know that, so it has to be what is already in place. Julie or Sabrina, do you want to address that?
So, you know, there's the general don't waste water, right? That's a general state mandate, you know.
Right.
Beneficial uses don't waste water. So, you know, that could be a number of things. In a certain community, they may consider what prior to this regulation, for instance, washing down sidewalks and driveways not a waste of water. So they had allowed that. And according to them, then they were meeting that state mandate to not waste water. Well, in addition to the state mandate prohibitions, for instance, to not waste water, they might implement a don't wash down sidewalks and driveways, if that makes sense. Or, you know, there are certain, you know, really big state mandates that we know are out there. And, you know, this, for instance, you know, efficient lawn watering, you know, don't water more than, you know, evapotranspiration factor of 0.7. That might be a state mandate. And what the supplier would do is say, only water on every other day. So that's in addition to the state mandate. That kind of thing.
Right. So we do know there are certain existing state mandates. And so you have to go above and beyond those in your stages.
And that's in the stages. So.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And last point, when you are writing out what your actions are going to be, your restrictions, there's a special consideration here on water features. The water code is, I'm not going to read that out loud, but in bold it says here, and it's not in water code, it's a summation. Restrictions on water use that will address water features must explicitly differentiate between pools and spas versus other water features. So if you're going to put in your actions, water shall not be supplied to any water feature, that's not going to work. You have to say what water features you're talking about. And you could use language that distinguishes, for example, a decorative water feature versus a recreational water feature. And that's just a suggestion, right? That language is not in code. What is in code is you have to treat these two very specifically. You have to differentiate between those two. Are there any questions?
Well, I think what we'll do, just in the interest of time, Gwen, we'll take our 5-minute break and we'll come back to any remaining questions towards the end of the webinar. I want to make sure we get through all the content. So I have 2:17. We'll take 5 minutes and be back at 2:22. Thanks, Gwen. Okay, it's 2:22, so hopefully everyone is back and Nancy is ready.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
So I want to thank Gwen for going through the last, I believe it was three elements of the water shortage contingency plan. I'm going to be speaking to the procedures, which is element 2, procedures for the annual water supply and demand assessment. This slide here is showing you the relationship, the bigger picture, so to speak, between the planning documents that are due this year and the assessment and report that will be due annually starting next year. As the water supply and demand assessment is a key element in the water supply, the water shortage contingency plan. And we are going to be discussing the procedures, but not the assessment and or the report. Next. As Gwen showed you earlier, there are several reliability assessments that are required. There is the next, the 2 longer term assessments that look forward in time, considering drought and other factors. And then the one we're speaking about today, which is the annual assessment. This slide is here to clarify a little of the terminology that I will be addressing. There is the assessment and report that are part of the implementation of the water shortage contingency plan. Again, that will be due starting 2022, the assessment next, and the report that will be due on July 1st of next year. But the procedures for the annual assessment, that is part of element 2, or what I'm going to be focusing on here today. If you want to, you can think about the procedures as a written recipe, so to speak, for a future batch of cookies. You don't have to have the cookies yet, or even the chocolate chips. What we're talking about here now is just the recipe. Next. Oh, so the previous slide was just showing you the water code, and it also contains directions as well. But I'm not going to go over the specifics because we're going to be going over those in future slides. However, it does point out to you the minimum requirements for the assessment procedures. But nothing prevents a water supplier from doing more. Just like adding walnuts to your favorite chocolate chip cookie recipe, you can enhance your procedures and make them even better. Next. Again, this is looking at the code. You'll see that the procedures must include the written decision-making process, the key data inputs, the assessment methodology. We will be going through each of these components in more detail. Next. First, we will start with the decision-making process. This is a process that an urban water supplier will use each year to determine its water supply reliability. These procedures will allow you, water suppliers, to determine your water supply reliability in a consistent manner every year. Like a good recipe, which can be tweaked and improved with practice, The procedures need a little fine tuning to perfect them. The written decision-making process describes the functional steps to determine the supplier's water supply reliability each year. So when you're thinking about this, what would you consider necessary to make a decision to activate water shortage response actions? Perhaps a formal presentation to your elected body, the board or council, and at this meeting, perhaps you're going to be requesting a vote on the findings of the annual assessment and approval to appropriately trigger any recommended shortage response actions. Next, I will discuss some recommended ideas to get you started. Here we have a table with some basic information and components that we recommend water suppliers place into their procedures. It's a starting point. Remember that you want the assessment to be consistent every year. And to do so, the procedures that you write up will need to have enough detail for any employees to follow. You will need to know who is responsible for the work and what they will be doing. You will also want to know what tools you will use to get the job done. One way to determine what directions your agency needs to make a decision is to look at a calendar, which may reveal procedural steps and the times to do them for your agency. Next. So we know that the report is going to be due in July 1st, 2022. So we're looking down the timeline and we need to consider what to do. Next. We are going to have the procedures due this July, however, and they will be adopted or are included in the water shortage contingency plan that will be included with the urban water management plan. Next. So I'm thinking about what needs to be done. When will you need to convene your water shortage contingency plan team? When will you begin to assess the supplies and demands based on current conditions? Next. When will you submit and present your preliminary report for your governing body? Do you have a template or a form to do so? Next. When can you finalize the assessment? When will you present and receive approval by your governing body? Next. And when will you first activate the shortage response actions? When will you finalize your annual water shortage assessment report? Remember that July 1st, starting 2022, the report is due. Annual water shortage assessment report. I hope this timeline helps you visualize what and when needs to be done for your agency. Next. Remember, these procedures are intended to help you meet your customers' demand and plan for shortfalls. You will need to take this recipe and make it work for you and your situation. It should be locally applicable, agency specific, looking at your local conditions and uncertainties. In addition to this timeline, you could put the same information into a table. Next. This is basically the same information we saw before, but put in a tabular format. Note that it is helpful to ensure meeting the requirements by having a timeline. You would be able to meet your milestones and know when to activate different activities. This is a good way to communicate the procedural steps to do the annual assessment. Of course, your table will need to be adjusted to your specific conditions. Here we see the collection and projection of the data and calculation of the annual water supply reliability. Next. This table continues with some procedural steps to implement the water shortage contingency plan. Again, you will need to adjust this to your specific situation. Here we see the finalizing of the assessment, requesting the governing body approval, as well as taking action if a shortage is determined. This is your own instruction manual, a place for you to describe the annual steps and timing to complete the annual assessment, such that it can be consistently followed year after year, even with changing supplier staff. You have a plan, directions, a recipe, if you will, on how to take the steps and ultimately make a decision. Next. Are there any questions?
Yeah, so Nancy, thank you. There are a couple of questions about the timing of the analysis itself. Gary's asking, for what 12-month period is the annual supply demand assessment prepared? July 1st to June 30th, next calendar year. And Joseph is asking if it's due in 2022. Why is the report being put out July 1st unless it only is for the first 6 months? So some clarification on the analysis timeline.
Well, thank you for those questions. Even though the law does not say the period, it doesn't really make sense to have the water supply and demand assessment occur in July, especially if you consider that might be in the middle of a drought. So you would want to be projecting forward, looking forward, so you can take timely actions. If you started the assessment in July, you're really limited with what you can do in the spring, late winter, early in spring, in order to, say, conserve water. Or you could do something, but it wouldn't be as effective. So in general, what I am recommending, and I believe, is that you would do this early, perhaps starting in January, or even at the beginning of the water year, if you want to go that early, and then move it forward and update those numbers as needed. As far as the why are we looking at the procedures now as opposed to in July of 2022, you have to have the procedures to do the report. And if you don't have the procedures, then you're not going to be able to get to the work early, as I had just mentioned is important to do in order to take effective action. Does anybody else want to chime in on this question?
Yes. The annual supply and demand assessments are for looking 1 year ahead. It doesn't matter if you are using calendar year, water year, fiscal year, whatever is your planning year, use it. But the idea is to look at current year's conditions. So let's say the first report that you are going to submit in July 2022. You are going to look at the year, that current year's condition, which let's say it's 21-22 water year. And based on your supply conditions for that year, you look ahead 1 year and assume that next year is going to be dry, and estimate whether you are going to be okay, or are you forecasting a shortage? So that's the key. Based on your current supplies for that year, look ahead for the next year, assuming it's going to be dry, and make sure you have enough supplies to cover that next year. Or if you are going to find that you will have shortage, then in your report of July 2022, you will say, I am estimating based on my current supplies this year that I will be short next year if it's going to be dry by 10%. And these are the actions I am going to undertake starting this summer.
Thanks, Betty. There is a comment from Julia responding to this question. Julia says, seems like you would want to match the same period as your UWMP. So if you use calendar year in the UWMP, you would use calendar year in annual report. Can you comment on that, making those consistent across both plans?
It does make sense, exactly. I mean, as I said, depending on your planning, then you choose whichever planning year you are using. We don't want to impose on you reporting on a different planning year. If you are using a calendar year, by all means, use calendar year for this one too. If you are using water year for your urban planning, by all means, use the same.
Okay, thank you. Gary, I see that you're raising your hand, but I want to make sure that I give Nancy enough time to go through all her presentation. So if it's okay, we'll just wait and take more questions. She still has more to cover. I want to make sure she gets to it. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay. Next, the second point after the written decision-making process is you need to include the key data inputs. Those are that will be used to evaluate the water supply reliability for the current year and one dry year that follows. You're imagining one dry year or assuming it. Next. This is what the water code says, but don't worry, I'm not asking you to read this busy slide. I just put it up there for informational purposes. But as you can see, there are 5 points underneath this section, and 4 of them are more targeted towards the key data inputs. Next. So in considering what data that you need to consider, let's first look at the demands. Next. What is the demand without any conservation measures? You want to think about the year's weather, what are the projections and water year type in your area? What is happening with the population? Is there growth? Are there any policies in place this year that will impact your demands? In addition to the demands, are there any issues with the infrastructure capacity? Are there planned outages for operation and maintenance? Next, we'll look at the supplies. Determine your current year supplies. In the code, it says that you have to include a description and quantification of each water source that was done as part of the urban water management plan. Consider the hydrological and regulatory conditions for this year. What data will you use for the assumed next dry year? And will you consider more than one dry year? You can if you want, and it works for you. Note, the description and quantification of each water supply source was done as part of the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. So you wouldn't be starting from scratch. You can find the actual numbers for 2020 in tables 6-8 and the projected numbers in table 6-9. We understand that the water quantities are in many places, and in reviewing the annual water shortage assessment reports, DWR will most likely be looking for consistency with the other water quantities that have been reported. So it's important that you are consistent and not reinvent the wheel. Make sure your numbers are within the ballpark, or there must be a serious reason why things have changed. whether you've increased because now you've developed desal or you've decreased because of some major catastrophe. Make sure those are explained, but in any case, those numbers should be consistent and within that ballpark. And you can reference those documents in order to make sure the people who are doing your assessment would be referencing those as well, so they know where to look. The other thing to consider here, which I had skipped, is the existing infrastructure capabilities and plausible constraints. Are there issues going on with the infrastructure that you need to consider? And what would those be in your area? Next. So are there any questions?
Let's see, I don't see any new questions, but I want to give Gary an opportunity to ask his question. He raised his hand. Go ahead, Gary.
Oh, okay. Well, I got two questions. One is about the going back to the period for which the supply demand assessment is supposed to apply. As I understand it, the supply demand assessment is supposed to guide the utilities, the water suppliers' actions immediately if there's a shortage anticipated. So if waiting until to not start that until January, 6 months later, that it doesn't strike me as what the SDA is about. So I assume that the period, because you want to apply it in the summer, that's now in the dry season, that is right now, if you're going to have a shortage, based on how wet, how dry or wet the winter was. So anyway, I'd just like you to comment on that or give us your thoughts.
I can comment on that. Thank you, Gary. That is a good question. And yes, by all means, we are not asking agencies to wait until late summer or after submitting their shortage assessment report to the state in July to start undertaking actions. You mentioned January. Actually, even if you start undertaking your actions that summer, I would say that's late, because as Nancy showed in one of the slides, ideally the agency would start looking at their condition early in the year, January, February, and they update their assessment as they go along. While doing that, and if the year is dry, they are expected to undertake actions already. So by July, when they finalize their shortage assessment that they are going to submit to us, they are probably undertaking a lot of the actions, and they are planning to undertake more. And those will be listed in their shortage report to the state. I hope that answers your question.
Did you want to follow up on that, Gary?
No, not right now. I submitted another question, but I won't monopolize the time here. So you get to my other question, that would be great.
All right.
Thank you. Why don't we continue, Nancy, to make sure that we get through your presentation, and as time allows at the end, we'll take more questions.
Sure. The next part of requirements for to have in your procedures is the assessment methodology. That would be a defined set of locally applicable evaluation criteria that are consistently relied upon for each annual water supply and demand assessment. Next. The final part required is this, and you will need to determine what tools you will use to calculate the current year's water supply reliability. What time step will you use? DWR strongly recommends a time step that will effectively capture your agency's particular situation. If your water supplies fluctuate and your water demands fluctuate with the seasons, it may be better to shorten up the time step so that you can capture when you are actually short versus when you have plenty of water. And then you can make effective decisions on whether you want to transfer that water or sell it or do some groundwater banking or some other needed use. When do you need to start the assessment to make the assessment meaningful and effective for your agency? Remember that you are more than likely going to have to look to your governing body to approve any shortage response actions that you recommend. And to wait, again, in my opinion, to the middle of summer to get their approval is kind of late, just like Gary had said. So how and when will these numbers be finalized? Those are some of the things that you need to consider for your plan and to add to your procedures so that it makes sense for your agency. Next. I just want to summarize the key steps that are needed for the procedures. Again, this is not the assessment or the report, which will be due next year. These are the procedures you will use to have a written making decision process, ready to move as soon as you can to take action in case of drought. You will want to have your key data inputs, next, and your assessment methodology so that you know how to consistently determine your water levels, your water shortage levels. Are there any questions?
Well, let's see, now that we have a little bit of time, we can go back to some of the questions that we had. So going to go through it. There is a question from Denise asking, what is DWR going to do with the annual water supply demand assessment information?
That is a really good question.
You've talked about how a supplier can use the information to improve their reliability, but wanting to understand DWR's role here.
There's a couple roles, obviously, for the water supply and demand assessment. During the drought, my understanding is there are some agencies who weren't adequately planning for their droughts. And when they communicated to the state, again, this is in my understanding, they weren't able to come up with what their water situation was in any way that made sense to, say, the governor's office. This is actually a plan and an activity that benefits everyone. The state, as the head of that, needs to look to the different agencies to be able to see where we are with our water shortages so that the state can also take action. Now, what exactly is going to be happening with these is that they will be submitted to DWR. They will be reviewed for compliance, and then we will be reporting information to the state board. DWR is not a regulatory agency, and so we will not have the ability to take any regulatory action. Does anybody else want to chime in?
Okay, thanks, Nancy. I'm going to read a comment from an anonymous participant who wanted to weigh in on response impacts, suggesting that we need to revisit this there. And the statement says, just to keep it for our webinar record, there are very serious challenges and a lot of complexities with attempting to estimate drought impacts by measure or group of measures. I think this request will mislead a lot of agencies. There are too many scenarios by types of supply, impacts in droughts, and too many variables by types of customers and their respective response rate within service area. This analysis has only been done in my experience as part of a complex and dynamic modeling exercise. As a result, this requirement seems impossible to solve for meaningful output. I have concerns about what will have to be published in the simplified format of the tables provided. This requirement should be an enhanced water shortage contingency plan recommendation, that's in parentheses suggestion, and not a requirement for quantification for table inputs in 2020. Perhaps this can be refined for 2025 or sooner with more refined guidance.
Okay, thank you. Good points. This is part of the water code that DWR can't change, and so we're bound to relay to you what the water code says. And I mean, I'm not sure if anybody else has a response to this, but I mean, it comes back to this is a planning exercise, and it can be presented that way. That's part of the important thing to remember and express as you write this up. That there is, as with any type of future event, you can't plan to precision, but you can plan that. But it's important to have a plan laid out for some version of a scenario that could be, of what you could do. So where do you go? What are you going to implement when these things start happening? That has to be laid out. I don't know, Fetty, you want to expand on that, or anybody else?
I mean, just a reminder, all of the tables allow for notes, and all of the text can have as much information in there to explain things as you want. The tables are just to capture the minimum and more details, because as this commenter noted, there's going to be a bazillion differences in different cases and different situations and different scenarios. So to capture those in detail in a table is not really very feasible. So it's just capturing the minimum, and there can be notes, lots of notes, as many as you want, and plenty of notes in the text to make sure that what you are estimating is reflected correctly in accordance to how you are looking at it.
Okay, thank you. So Nancy, I don't see necessarily specific questions about your presentation, but I'm just going back to look at some of the questions that participants had asked about the plan in general. I see a question that received several upvotes from Denise, who says many agencies have ordinances or plans, not necessarily called water shortage contingency plan, that they use for their plan elements. So now the requirement is to have a plan called that. Is that correct?
I think that this is a simple, like a language piece where you can, oops, I think the question just disappeared.
Oh, sorry.
That where you can't see, I don't know where it went.
Oh.
But anyways, you can you know, you can see, so if you have ordinances and pieces of plans, or maybe the entire plan that fulfills what is all the requirements of a water shortage contingency plan, then I think that it would be sufficient to just refer to, you know, say this at the top of it, this is a fulfillment of the water shortage contingency plan for X supplier. That, would you agree, Sabrina or Betty?
So, you know, okay, many agents, ordinance or plans, not necessarily, okay. Yeah, I mean, the essential answer is yes. And what you would do is you take all those different pieces, slap it under one header, make sure it has all the elements of WSCP and call it WSCP and adopt it, and poof, you're done. Or you might have to fill in a couple of elements that you don't have. But for the ones you do already have, yeah. And then they're all bundled in one little package.
So overall, refer and borrow from other resources and plans that you already have in place to meet the requirements is what you're offering.
And I think part of what this is the water shortage contingency plan. It's taking some of these pieces that are all over and putting it into a whole, if that makes sense. One context, one whole, a one-stop shopping place for your drought response things.
Okay, so a couple of other questions since we have a little bit of time. In reference to the tables that were discussed earlier, asking for clarifications on where to find the tables, not seeing them in Appendix E.
Yeah, the tables for the water shortage contingency plan that Gwen went through are in the submittal tables Excel template. They're under chapter 8 of the guidebook, the Urban Water Management Plan guidebook.
Okay, thank you. All right, and back to the presentation on supply augmentation measures. Barbara's asking, are these supply augmentation measures going to be clearly referenced and quantified so it is possible for reviewers to see if these are realistic, especially in light of SGMA, groundwater pumping? If numerous suppliers reference the same potential sources, it needs to be clear if there is a double counting. Same with referencing water transfers with junior water rights holders that could be curtailed.
I think it's important for suppliers as they look into their contingency planning and the emergency supplies that they are planned to use, to be aware that some of those things, as mentioned in the comment or the question, might be targeted by others or neighboring agencies. So that's why as they develop these strategies, they need to coordinate and with other suppliers and on a regional basis, so that double counting doesn't happen and not everybody is planning to purchase these couple acre feet from whatever reservoir where there are only a couple acre feet and they don't go, they can't be shared by 10 suppliers, let's say. That is unfortunately something that the supplier themselves, when they plan, they need to look into that.
Okay, thanks, Feti. There's a question from Samuel going back to the discussion on shortage levels. What data is used to determine the shortage level? How would it be determined for a system that relies mainly on groundwater?
the data
I-
is,
Yeah.
go ahead, Fatih.
I mean, it's on a case by case specific. It depends on your sources. If let's say you have groundwater wells that produce this much under normal conditions, and that meets your demand. If your current conditions shows the water table is dwindling or going down, or there is not enough recharge for the last several years, and your yield is affected, and you estimate you can't pump as much, that's the estimate that will give you how much short will you will be. So again, it's a case by case scenario, and depending on your conditions, and looking at your supply or your source, you estimate if you can produce normal or have shortage.
Thanks, Betty. Did Sabrina want to add to this, or are we
No.
good? Okay, thank you. Okay, going back to some of the actions, Greg is asking for clarification, saying presumably locally appropriate could mean no action in a particular category at a particular stage, couldn't it? So can you talk a little bit about the phrase locally appropriate, and how would you would describe that?
At the March presentation 2020, there was a lot of comments from agencies that had groundwater sources, and they said that they didn't really need, they never ran out of water. Apparently, maybe their groundwater basins are recharged and never go dry, but we know that in the Central Valley, there was some subsidence, et cetera. So in those situations, you know, they'd have to explain, you know, why they say that they have an unlimited supply. And, but in any case, it is locally, they're local conditions. We can't say what that is for us. We can only review what you give us. So you just need to justify and explain so that we can understand. Obviously, if it's a groundwater situation, you would want to make sure you're conferring with your local ground water sustainability agency group, and any other situations like that. Make sure that you are communicating with the other people around you to make sure that, you know, you are doing the best for your situation. But yes, it doesn't necessarily have to be on a monthly time step if you do have a perpetual supply.
And the idea is
adding
for
on
the
this,
supplier. Sorry. Go ahead, Jill.
I was just going to say, is this the Greg's question, Ari? This is
Yeah.
presumably locally appropriate. So I don't think that locally appropriate means no action. I mean, you don't have to report that if you're not going to take any demand reduction actions for a specific shortage level, then you wouldn't make any up. You know, you would just put in your supply augmentation actions that you're going to do to meet that shortage gap. But I don't really see how no action. I mean, I'm reading the water code, just where it says the shortage response actions that align with the defined shortage levels included minimum all the following, and locally appropriate supply augmentation actions, the locally appropriate demand reduction actions. What Nancy was getting at, of, you know, that you have action. We're not going to, the state isn't dictating what actions you're going to take. You want to make them locally appropriate. Hope that makes sense.
And to follow up on that also, there are situations where perhaps if they are on groundwater and they think their supply is unlimited, but then they have contamination or wells that are out of operation, maybe by fire or other instances, that they would want to know like where they could go to get supplemental supply, and that should be listed for their
So,
agency.
it could be also the situation where at levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, you don't have a supply augmentation because you don't need it. Your demand reduction is fine. So it's not included in your suite of actions until you hit level 5, for instance, or level 6, at which point you would implement a supply augmentation action. So there's that way to look at that question and that answer too. Or any action, not just even supply augmentation. You know, we have a list of demand reduction actions as well as the supply augmentation actions, and you don't have to like address every single one of those. You know, when you got a 10% shortage, you're going to have to do something because that means you're not going to meet 10% of the needs of the community. So something's going to happen, but it may be different at level 1 than it is at level 2, and that's fine.
Thanks, Sabrina. I just want to follow up with that. There is a question asking, will actions effectiveness quantification estimates need to be documented, and can ranges be used for actions that can be directly quantified?
In general,
Yeah.
it's an estimate. Yeah, to the best that you can document an estimate where you came up with that, the better it is, but it's an estimate, you know. We can't ask for more than that, but documentation is good. So the next time someone does an estimate, they can, you know, look at what you thought was right and see if it worked or not. A range won't necessarily get you to your 10%, 20%, 30%, or whatever you're going to need, you know. But you know, in your text, you can say I'm estimating this much and put it in a range, and then, you know, do the average for your table so that you can come up with a number that meets your gap, right? So, I mean, it's okay. And you can explain in notes. You can put your range in notes if you choose to use, you know, just one number in the table. You can definitely say, you know, this number came from assuming a range of X to Y.
And
Yeah,
so,
if you do use ranges though, you should make sure that the minimum of all your ranges adds up to the fulfilling the need of the shortage gap. And there have been other people that have asked about the ranges. So
okay. And I'm hearing Fetty suggest use an average based on your range. Following up on the just what Sabrina just covered in terms of description, Gary's asking, this is a bit of a table management. The revised table 8.1 asks for narrative description of the actions at each stage. What does that mean? We will have a zillion actions at each level at increasing levels of implementation. So what level of detail are you looking for when there are multiple actions entered into the tables?
So in the table, you want it to be pretty short because you're going to put a sentence or two, or maybe 3, but not too much. That's just to give some snapshot of what the bundle of response actions involves. That's the purpose of providing it there.
They can choose from.
No, this is a narrative description of the actions
the
in
narrative,
table
okay.
8-1.
You could
You
do
know,
something.
And then, okay, go.
I was going to say you could say something, it's very brief, but say demand reduction will address the shortage, or demand reduction will address 50% of the shortage, supply augmentation will address the other 50%. That would be a summary.
you could also say things like, for some people, they're going to do they're not going to do different actions, but they're going to do increasing levels of an action. And that might be where you describe that process. Like, I'm going to have an education program in level 1. And then in level 2, I'm going to have an expanded education program. And then level 3, I'm going to like go out there and have a marketing program that, it's you can do things like that in that description too.
Okay, and there are a couple of questions more generally about where the water shortage contingency plan reside, and asking if there is a difference between the standalone plan and the water shortage contingency planning chapter in the urban water management plan. Can you clarify that?
Sure. So you can include it as an attachment or appendix, or you can include it as your chapter 8. If you include it as an appendix, it'd be great and easier on reviewers if you just put a note in your chapter, in the portion of your urban water management plan that says the fulfillments of the water shortage contingency plan are reported in this appendix, and point to that. But
Okay, so they're essentially the same thing. You can either include it in the urban water management plan or include it as an appendix and reference it in the plan. Is that correct?
right,
Okay.
right.
All right. Okay. Well, we're at our break time. So thank you, Nancy, for your presentation and for the Q&A portion. We had a chance to respond to many of your questions. We'll take a 5-minute break and we'll start up again at 3:20 with Gwen, who's going to continue and present on the remaining elements of the plan. Thanks, everyone. All right, so welcome, everyone. I'm hoping everyone is back and that Gwen is ready to go.
I am ready to go. I'd like to share my screen if that's okay.
Go ahead.
And, oh, shoot, hang on. Okay. There we go. Sorry, it's taking me a minute to get set up here. From current slide. Okay, so as a review, there are 10 elements that have to be covered, plus the seismic assessment. And we've gone through the seismic assessment and 1 through 4. And I would say that 1 through 4 are really the meat of your water shortage contingency plan. So these last bits that we're picking up now, items 5 through 10, are important, but just to let you know, you've gotten through the bulk and the meat of your water shortage conservation plan requirements in what you've heard so far. The next thing I'm going to talk about is item number 5, which is communication protocols. And there was a question that would we please mention the items when they come up that don't apply to water wholesalers? Communication protocols does apply to water wholesalers, so you'll have to address this. This is the code. I put red letters here for the annual water supply and demand assessment because the communication protocols, at a minimum, are asking you to communicate about what you've determined in your annual water supply and demand assessment, okay? It also says any other relevant communications, but foremost, it's pointing to what your annual supply and demand assessment has come up with and communicating that. Okay. So when are you going to make a communication? When a water shortage condition exists or is anticipated. When a supplier is implementing a water shortage level and associated response actions. I put that first bullet in there because there might be other times outside of your annual assessment when you discover that you're in a water emergency or a water supply shortage that you didn't anticipate in your annual assessment. Okay. What is it that you're going to communicate? That a water shortage condition exists or is anticipated. You will also communicate the water shortage levels, the stage, and the associated response actions that have been triggered by the annual assessment. Now, again, if it's an emergency situation that you didn't see through your annual assessment, you'll still want to communicate that, okay? But you're going to talk about which stage is being implemented and what the response actions are that are being triggered. Who must you communicate to? The code specifies that you have to communicate with the public, and you have to communicate with public entities and officials. So you're going to have two different audiences here. So you have to consider how you're going to address, which is the how you're going to address each one of these audiences. So your communication protocol, this you want to be something that you're putting into place so that even if you have a change of staff, when, let's say, an urgent situation comes up or your annual assessment triggers that you are going to have a shortage. In either case, even if you have new staff on board, they can pick up your water shortage contingency plan, look at these communication protocols. Who am I going to reach out to? I have to reach out to the public. I have to reach out to public entities and officials. How am I going to do that? Do I have a list of contact information? And that, of course, will have to be updated all the time. At a minimum, you could put which office within a department, for example. And what you're going to communicate, right? So the new staff that's come in, and now we've got this new level being triggered, and it has to be communicated. They can pick up this protocol and say who they have to communicate it to and what they have to communicate. That needs to go into your water shortage contingency plan. I wanted to say something about emergency water shortage or unforeseen, right? You didn't anticipate this in your annual supply and demand assessment. So these catastrophic or emergency shortages are also going to utilize those same stages that you have of the standardized stages that have these responses that are hardwired to them. In an emergency, what can you can rely upon your emergency response plan. Okay, that is something from the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, requires community water systems to have an emergency response plan, an ERP. You can incorporate elements from the ERP. For example, you may have in your ERP a communication protocol in case of an emergency. So of course you don't want to try and reinvent the wheel, especially you wouldn't want that wheel to be different from the one in your emergency response plan. So it would be best practice to just take those communication protocols from the emergency response plan, put those into your communication protocol for an emergency or catastrophic unanticipated supply reduction into your water shortage contingency plan. Are there questions on the communication procedures or protocols that have to go into your plan?
I don't see any question, Gwen.
Okay, good. That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, maybe just wait a few seconds in case people are typing. Let me see if there's a question. Can we refer to the ERP instead of cupping?
Instead of what?
instead of copying information, can you just, can a supplier just reference the ERP?
There's nothing that says you can't, but I would say if that water shortage contingency plan is a standalone document that the entire staff can go to in any time of a water shortage, it would be good to have some elements that might be needed immediately copied and put into your water shortage contingency plan. But there's not a requirement to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You can simply refer to the ERP.
All right, thank you. That's the only question that we have, so we can move forward. Oh, I see. There's a follow-up just highlighting the fact that the ERP communications may change. And so if you're including the actual details, it may be outdated. As a reference
There was also
to that
the
question.
comment. Yeah, there was also the comment earlier today about ERPs are not necessarily public documents, so they could include sensitive content. So we recognize and respect that too. But yeah, I mean, that seems either way seems appropriate to include it or not include it. It seems it would be appropriate to paste in, like Gwen was saying, they could, but with a reference or something.
And it's always
Or
true about this contact information that it's so variable. I mean, changeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
As new staff come or someone changes their phone number, mostly it's moving around of staff or who the appropriate person is. Maybe they've reorganized an office or something. That's just going to be a challenge, right? Keeping that information up to date.
Yeah, good point. Okay, thank you. So why don't we continue, and we have a couple more opportunities for people to ask questions.
Okay. I'm combining elements number 6 and 7 because they're both kind of short. And we'll take questions about both of these in a moment at the end. So item number 6 is compliance and enforcement. And item number 7 is legal authority. Compliance and enforcement. You have to include in your water shortage contingency plan for a retail water supplier, wholesalers, sorry, I didn't mention this earlier, wholesalers do not have to address this. Your customer compliance, enforcement, appeal, and exemption procedures for these shortage response actions, right, that you're going to implement. What are we talking about with compliance and enforcement? Describe the measures that you'll use to enforce the compliance with the triggered actions. Maybe an enforcement will be you're going to increase your water waste patrols. Maybe you're going to implement fines and surcharges. Maybe you'll have warnings and citations and protocols for that. Maybe you'll implement your drought rate structure. So these are some of the mechanisms that you can use. You're implementing stage 3, you've got water lawn restrictions, among other things. How do you make people comply? Or how do you enforce that, right? You need to come up with whatever suite of mechanisms are available to you. Additionally, you're going to describe, so let's say you've implemented stage 3 with your water waste restrictions or lawn watering restrictions, and someone the first time around, oh, we have a water waste patrol or a neighbor complaint and they're watering when they shouldn't be watering. First, you're going to give them a warning, let's say. Then the second time around, you might give them a fine, let's just say. Then they're going to appeal that because they have some special situation. So you need to be able to write in your water shortage contingency plan what their appeal procedure would be. And also if there are any known stated exemptions to whatever responses you're going to put into place. So that's it on the compliance and enforcement. You must put that into your plan. You must also state in your plan your legal authority. Now, item number A is a broad umbrella of all the authority that you have to implement these, implement and enforce these actions. Says to include statutory authorities, ordinances, resolutions, and contract provisions, among others. Letter B and letter C are simply statements that cite specific authority. Okay, for the overall umbrella, you're going to disclose legal authority that you rely upon to implement and enforce these response actions. List all relevant authorities. If a supplier doesn't have sufficient authority or they're pursuing additional authority, describe the limits of your current authority and discuss your planned actions to pursue the additional authority. Now, those statements, B and C, are these. Number one, you're going to include a statement that the supplier shall declare a water shortage emergency in accordance with Water Code Chapter 3, Division 1, which is stated right here. And that says you're going to, the supplier, the governing body, will declare a water shortage emergency when it finds that the ordinary demands and requirements of water consumers cannot be satisfied without depleting the water supply of the distributor to the extent that there would be insufficient water for human consumption, sanitation, and fire. So you want to put into your water shortage contingency plan that you do have legal authority to do just that. And number two, the second statement that you're going to include, that you will coordinate with any city or county within which you provide water supply if you're going to do a proclamation of a local emergency. So legal authority has three items. One is the umbrella of all the authorities that you have to implement and enforce. And then these two statements about specific authorities. And are there any questions about compliance, enforcement, or legal authority?
There is a comment from a participant, Gwen, who says, during COVID, we have not been allowed to shut off water due to non-payment. If COVID continues, fines and surcharges could get very tricky. So just a comment on where we are right now. I don't see any questions.
Yeah, good point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's hope that COVID goes away sooner rather than later, or we all get inoculated and it won't be a concern.
All right. So with no questions, I suggest maybe, do you have another portion to your presentation? Why don't we continue?
I certainly do. So this is item number 8. You must include the financial consequences of implementing your water shortage contingency plan. This does not apply to wholesalers. This is retail only. So you have to describe potential revenue reductions and expense increases with activating those response actions and the mitigation actions needed to address those revenue reductions. As well, item number C is a little different animal. 1 and 2 deal with the shortage response actions that we've been talking about. Item number 3 kind of comes out of left field. It refers to a different section of Water Code entirely. I will talk about that in a minute. Let's first talk about A and B. Oh, okay. C is in a drought emergency prohibiting excessive water use and the financial consequences of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. First, we'll talk about shortage response actions and financial consequences. So again, we're referring back to these actions that you implemented, whether demand reduction or supply augmentation, and provide a narrative description, tabular if you have it. If you want it, great. At a minimum, a narrative description. And what I mean is, I don't mean at a minimum. What I mean is the tables that we have here, 8.2 and 8.3, which talk about these different actions. In the table, there's no place to put in the financial consequence. So you would report that outside of these tables. If you have another table, great. If you want to do it narrative, also great. There's no direction from the code on how to report it. Okay. Provide the description of potential revenue reductions by activating these response actions and mitigation actions needed to address. For example, if the response actions are to reduce all lawn watering, that's going to reduce the amount of water that you sell to all your customers that have lawns that water their lawns. So you want to give an estimate of when you stop lawn watering, what's that going to do to your revenue? And how are you going to address that? Whether it's going into reserves, going into a drought rate structure where other prices go up to compensate, whatever you have in your toolkit. Okay, now there's this funny one that comes out from a different section of water code. You have to describe the cost of compliance of prohibiting excessive water use during a drought emergency. Okay. This is the other section of the water code that it's talking about. This is not the Urban Water Management Planning Act. In this other section of water code, it says that retail suppliers are required to discourage or prohibit excessive water use during a drought emergency. Again, this is not in the Urban Water Management Planning Act. Okay, here is what the water code sections are. State of emergency triggering prohibitions. It has to be a declared statewide drought emergency. You've moved to a stage that requires mandatory water use reductions, and it's declared local drought emergency. And methods to prohibit excessive water use, rate structure, excessive water use ordinance. Okay, all of that is not required to report in the Urban Water Management Plan. Now, I think it would be a great thing to report in your Urban Water Management Plan or your Water Shortage Contingency Plan, because it's all kind of the same territory that we're talking about here, but we can't require it because the code doesn't require it. What is required? The cost of compliance for prohibiting excessive water use during a drought emergency. It's odd. The code is sometimes odd, but that's what it is. Okay, so financial consequences are the questions on reporting or including in your water shortage contingency plan, your best estimates for financial consequences of these response actions, and the financial consequences of prohibiting excessive water use during a drought emergency. Those are the things you have to include.
All right, thanks, Gwen. So we have just a couple of questions going back to elements 6 and 7. There is a question for compliance and legal authority. Are these meant to be general sections or separated by shortage level?
It doesn't state, I believe it is not stated in the code. Yeah.
I think general.
Yeah, it appears to be general.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to check
Jill,
on
you
that
wanna-
while we go to
okay.
another question, because I feel like that's come up before, Jill, and I need to check. I think it might be, I thought it was only whole retailers.
You know, in table 8.2, which lists the demand reduction actions, and you list it by stage and action, quantification of the gap reduction. And the last column says penalty or enforcement, yes or no. So it doesn't ask you to specify in that table, but in that table it does, by action, you will say yes or no whether or not you have an enforcement mechanism. So that's a specific, but in general, you also have to provide this overview of customer compliance, appeal, et cetera, as shown on the screen.
I think the question was about, compliance and legal authority as opposed to specific just in enforcement, like what are you going to do if someone doesn't water? It's like, do you have the ordinance or authority to back you up to say, for instance, have a fine if somebody doesn't do something they're supposed to do? Do you have somewhere in, a resolution that's or some sort of, legal authority that says, I can implement enforcement that I have laid out here? Or what mechanisms do I have that says, I can do something if there is non-compliance? And how far does that take me? Or do I need to, pursue something else? So yeah, the description of the legal authorities that give you the right to implement any enforcement.
So Sabrina, that's just a confirmation that it's more of a general section as opposed to being shortage level specific.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, there may be in some cases where you'll need more than one authority, like for some kinds of actions, you would need one set of authority. For another kind of set of actions, you might need a different authority. I don't know. It's going to be, dependent upon the particular local situation. But if you say you're going to enforce, an action by fines, you need to have, what is your legal authority to do fines? You say you're going to enforce your action by I don't know, public shaming. You need to describe what the authorities you have for public shaming.
Yeah, it looks like the authorities are related to the shortage response actions, not the shortage levels. Whatever actions you undertake, make sure you have the authority and provide proof of that.
Okay. That's a helpful clarification. Let's see, there were a couple of other questions, but they seem to have, maybe they were addressed. Let's see. There is a question from Autumn is, no, okay. Another question for the seismic risk assessment. If suppliers are currently developing their hazard mitigation plan and won't be done before the urban water management plan is due, what can they use instead to show assessment of seismic risk to water suppliers? Can they use AWI, ARRA? So other resources.
Julie?
They can always use other resources. They don't have to use that local hazard mitigation plan. That's just, if the local hazard mitigation plan has the things that water code says must be in your seismic hazard assessment and mitigation, then good, yay. You can use the information there. If you don't have it, you're going to have to figure that out yourself. You're going to use other resources. You just have to make sure that it does a seismic hazard risk assessment and that it has mitigation for the seismic hazard risk in the event it actually happens. But you don't have to use the local hazard mitigation plan. You don't have to use the RRA. You don't have to use the emergency response plan. those are resources you can use.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions, clarification. Autumn is asking.
And Orit,
Yeah.
I do have, there is one more section that I have to present on.
Okay, so that's a good reminder. Clarification, is the water code requiring section 8.8 to include actual dollar amounts by response action?
Ooh. For the financial, where to go?
Before that.
Oh, is it? Okay, financial, there it
Here we
is.
go. Cost of compliance. Mhm.
Well, that could be subject to interpretation. Sometimes one of the attorneys at DWR once said, you know, talk to your own attorneys, because could be interpreted one way or the other. Could be interpreted that it has to be for each, doesn't say those words.
It does, is the question about quantifying it using dollar amounts? It doesn't
Or
look
by
like
action.
that because it says description. One
Mm.
of them, it says description. It doesn't say quantify the revenue reductions.
Yeah, so a similar question is asking how specific the description needs to be on financial consequences. If it doesn't have to have the detailed dollar amount, any thoughts on the specificity of the description?
Well, I thought the question was, and I understand it now, I thought the question was, does it have to be action by action? It makes sense that it
Mhm.
would be, but the code doesn't say that specifically.
Okay. There are a few other questions, but I think it would be helpful to have you finish your presentation, Gwen.
Okay. Financial consequences. Okay, here are the last ones. Monitoring and reporting of the water shortage contingency plan and refining the water shortage contingency plan. Number 9, monitoring and reporting does not apply to wholesalers. Let's jump into that one. So this is what the code says. For urban retail water supplier, monitoring and reporting, you have to include monitoring and reporting requirements and procedures to ensure appropriate data is collected, tracked, and analyzed for purposes of monitoring customer compliance and to meet state reporting requirements. So if you're implementing a particular shortage stage, how do you know it's effective, right? This is the crux of this requirement. You have to have a monitoring and reporting protocol to know whether or not you're getting the response that you need. And that's generally by measuring. Once you've implemented an action, you start measuring the water use, and has that made the difference that you need it to, or the supply. Okay, monitoring either way. So you have to include the procedures for monitoring and reporting customer compliance with the water shortage contingency plan. And last step, number 10, is you have to also include refinement procedures for the water shortage contingency plan. You must include the procedures for reevaluating and improving. And of course, you're going to rely upon that previous step of monitoring. So you see if you got the effect that you needed, and if not, how are you going to refine the water shortage contingency plan so you can get the effect that you need to meet the gap. Are there questions on those last two, monitoring and refining?
So there are actually a few more questions from the previous section. Maybe I'll start with that. Jill wants to clarify, Gwen, if you said that, and this is back to financial consequences, if you said that the requirement to describe the financial consequences of and responses for drought conditions don't apply to wholesalers. Jill says, I thought that the only section 10632A8C didn't apply to wholesalers. Can you clarify that?
I don't think I said that the financial consequences, oh, I did say the financial consequences don't apply. So this is Julie or Sabrina, you can discuss this because this I took from the guidebook as not applicable to wholesalers. And there's the code.
That's a FETI question.
Okay, that would help.
I don't think it's not applicable. It looks like it's applicable for all suppliers because all suppliers are required to take demand reduction actions and supply augmentation actions. And this is part of looking into the financial side of undertaking those actions. It doesn't seem restricted to retailers only.
I think part of the confusion, Gwen, is that in the slide 15 earlier in this presentation, there was a red cross out for that was the slide that said water shortage contingency plan elements for wholesalers, and it crossed out financial consequences of the water shortage contingency plan.
And are you saying that that shouldn't, looks like that shouldn't be crossed out?
Looks like the only
Right.
the only elements that the code shows that they're restricted to retailers are element number 6. Specifically, it says an urban retail supplier. And element number 9 specifically says for an urban retail water supplier.
Okay,
All
wow,
others
so sorry about that. Yeah, financial consequences do then apply to wholesalers as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's
Thank you
good
for
that we
the
clarified that.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Another question related to legal authority. If retailer provide water to a jurisdiction that is not within its city limits and is not covered in their municipal code, do they need to establish legal authority elsewhere?
It does look like it's prudent to do that because if they are going to enforce certain actions and fines and things, I think it would be a good idea for them to establish such authority.
Okay, thanks, Betty. And so we're coming right to the 4 o'clock hour. And so I want to give Julie an opportunity to close the training. There is a question that had several thumbs up wanting to ask if related to the plan and the guidebook, and asking if what is the probability of the July 1st due date being deferred? That was Jenny's question, and several wanted to know the answer to that.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, as DWR staff, we have no control over changing that deadline, and that is written in the water code. So my understanding is it would take a change from a different authority, the governor or the legislature, to make to move those deadlines.
Okay. All right, so I'll let you talk about some upcoming opportunities for additional training.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you to Nancy and to Gwen so much for the presentations today, and for Sabrina and Fetty for clarifying so many things, and to Reed for facilitating, fantastic as always. So we have, the first thing we wanted to note in the next slide is that there is CalWEP is providing an upcoming training, and part of they've updated their Jumpstart Water Shortage Toolkit. And so this, for those of you that are members, this will be available, both the toolkit and the webinar. So just wanted to flag that'll be on February 11th at 1 p.m. So you can find more details at the CalWEP webpage. In terms of the other trainings on the next slide that we are offering, as you can go to the next slide, so this is the 8th of the Urban Water Management Plan training sessions, and we expect that there will be 10. So we have one more planned, but all the ones so far, including this one, it will be posted on the DWR YouTube page, and it's a standalone playlist for the Urban Water Management Plan training sessions. That we have 2 more that are coming up, and so the next slide here is, again, on February 10th is the next session. It's going to run from 10 a.m. to noon, and then that's on the preparation, adoption, and submittal of urban water management plans and water shortage contingency plans. And then in late March or April, we'll do another one on how to use the WUI data portal, which is the web page or submission, the portal where you're going to submit your plan and the information in the tables. As I said, and on repeat, that this training has been recorded along with the other ones. It will be posted at this long link shown below, and we'll put that in the chat too, so you have access to it, but it will take you directly to the playlist page on our YouTube site, so you can see the other trainings. And this one, we expect it will be posted by next week. And the materials from, or the slide deck that we've shown here will be posted on the WUI stakeholder SharePoint site. If you do not have access to that yet, please contact James Campagna with a request at wue@water.ca.gov, and he will give you access to that SharePoint site. And so thank you all for coming. We have one more poll we wanted to do just to gauge whether the training was helpful or not. So thank you.
All right, here we go. Thank you for responding to the poll. It's helpful to get your feedback as we continue and work on these training webinars. And thanks again to Nancy and Gwen for your presentation and responding, the whole team responding to the questions and comments that we received today. We'll give you a few more seconds and I'll post the poll for everyone.
And are we just a flag that for the question and answers that we've written in, I think that we'll have those in a big table, and we can post those also on the SharePoint site so that people have access to those, especially would be, for those question and answers, or the questions that haven't been answered.
Okay, great. And it looks like most people found the presentations and discussion helpful. So really appreciate everyone's participation, and we'll look forward to the next webinar on the 10th. Thanks, everyone.